So let's make this a generic async reducer. So that's actually the first thing I'm going to do is I'll just copy, paste, get rid of that. And now our Pokemon info reducer is like, what's going on? Well, I've got news for you. We're going to make a use async function. Sweet. And we're going to move all of this stuff up into here. And instead of the Pokemon info reducer, this is going to be our async reducer. So this is going to be our generic use async hook for handling any asynchronous logic for our app, which is great. And now, because this is a generic thing, we need to genericize all of the state here. So rather than Pokemon, this is just going to be a generic data. So we'll say Pokemon is now data. Get rid of all that. Sweet. Looking good, looking good. And now we don't know what the Pokemon name is because this is going to be generic, right? So we'll just initialize our status to idle, and then we'll allow people to provide us with some initial state, and we'll combine that initial state with our default. So they can override whatever initial state they want to, specifically the status in our case. And instead of Pokemon, we want this to be data. Sweet. So far, so good. But we've got a couple of things that are complaining over here. And honestly, this whole use effect should all be inside of our custom hook as well. So let me grab all of that and paste it right here. So Marty the Moneybag was helping you out, but I'm going to get rid of this and we'll talk about what we're doing here. So here we have the Pokemon name. We need to genericize that, but we need to have some sort of mechanism for the users of this hook to say, hey, actually, I know that there was an update and there was a change or something, but I don't want to make an asynchronous action here at all. I just want to exit early. So what we're going to do is we have this fetch Pokemon as well. We don't want to make that call. So we're going to accept a callback function that will give us that promise. So what I'm going to do is we'll accept as the first argument an async callback. And then in our use effect, the first thing we'll do is call that async callback. Now, before we were calling this async thing right here, now we're going to call it before we do this exit early. So we're going to make it so that people who are using use async will have to return a promise if they actually want the async thing to happen, or just return nothing if they don't. So we'll get that promise. And if they return early from that async callback or whatever, or explicitly return null or undefined, then we'll exit early at that point. And then here, we can just take that promise that they've given us and add our event handlers like this. So the next thing we're going to want to do is this is no longer Pokemon, but generically data. And then down here, our dependencies are all kinds of messed up. So let me get rid of these and let's talk about these dependencies. So if I let Dan Abramoff fill these dependencies in, we're going to run into a bit of a problem. And let me explain what that problem is. So here's use async callback. We call it in our use effect. And because we're calling this external dependency in our use effect, we have to include it in our dependency array. Now before we were doing just fine with the fetch Pokemon with the Pokemon name, and we just had to include the Pokemon name in here. We didn't need to include fetch Pokemon, and the reason that we don't need to include fetch Pokemon in our dependency list is because it's coming from a module level import, which can never possibly change, and so we don't need to include it in our dependency list because it'll never change anyway. But now we're accepting a function here that could change. We don't have the static code analysis capabilities to know whether or not the people who are using use async ever actually change this async callback. And so we have to include the async callback in this dependency array. Otherwise, if they change that async callback, the state of the world could fall out of sync with the state of our app. But here's the real kicker. So now this async callback that we're passing here is going to trigger our effect to get rerun anytime it changes. But the problem is that the way that we're going to use this is right here. So we're going to say, hey, use async. Here's your callback function. And every single time this Pokemon info re-renders, this callback function is going to be completely different because we're defining it inside the render. And we have to define it inside the render. We couldn't put it up here because we don't have access to the Pokemon name up here. So we have to put it right here. But this basically is going to trigger our use effect to get called over and over and over again. And so what we're going to do is actually accept a third argument here, which is going to be our list of dependencies. And we'll pass that list of dependencies here instead. We're going to get a warning about this, so let's, I don't really like doing this, but we're going to disable this rule for this line. And we'll fix this in a future lesson, but this is what we're going to do for now because the ESLint plugin isn't sure that we're including all the dependencies that we should be. So now with that, we also need to make sure we include our initial state of status. And if we have a Pokemon name, then this status is going to start out as pending, otherwise it'll be idle. And then instead of Pokemon coming from our state, this is actually going to be called data, and we'll just alias it to Pokemon, and everything else should continue to work. So let's save that. And oh, there's one last thing. Thank you, Error Boundary, for catching this. Data of state as it is undefined. All right, that makes sense because we're not returning our state. So let's go ahead and return the state. And now this should work. Cannot read property image of undefined. All right, let's figure out what's going on here. So this is going to be happening in our Pokemon data view when we have successfully resolved the promise and we're forwarding along the Pokemon, and it looks like the Pokemon is not getting set properly. So let's follow the code here and see if we can figure this out together. Here I'm saying if we don't have a Pokemon, then just return. That's going to trigger this exit early, so that's working just fine. Here we're going to return fetch Pokemon. That'll return a promise for that Pokemon name, and that seems to be working just fine. We get into this dispatch. We do get the type resolved here. We are forwarding along the data, and then up here we're taking the action.pokemon. Whoopsies. So this is going to be action.data, and this is going to fix our bug. So we'll say Pikachu, da-da-da-da, thank you Charizard, and if we do a typo here, then we're still going to get our nice error boundary. Everything's working splendidly. So I'm not a super huge fan of this bit. We'll fix that later, but everything's working right now. So I'm going to go ahead and take us through a quick review. So we had a bunch of stuff inside of our Pokemon info for managing the asynchronous state, and we wanted to kind of ditch that because we want to use this same asynchronous logic in multiple places of our application. Pretty common thing to do. And so we made a use async hook and accepted parameters for everything that we need. So the async callbacks, or whatever it is that we want to do, that's the async thing. The initial state, so that we could initialize the status to be pending if we wanted it to. The dependencies for whenever we want this async callback to be recalled because the state of the world has fallen out of sync with the state of our app. And then here we have our use effect, which has the dependencies listed. We have to ignore the ESLint rule because the React Hooks exhaustive depths rule from ESLint isn't capable of really knowing for sure that these dependencies are correct. So it gives us that warning, and we're just going to ignore it for now, and we'll fix that later. And then in our use effect, we're going to call the async callback. If nothing's returned, like in the case of no Pokemon name, then we'll exit early. We won't actually do anything else. Otherwise, we'll dispatch a pending action. We'll add a then onto the promise that we got back. And when there's a success, then we'll dispatch a resolved type with that success data. If there's an error, we'll dispatch a rejected type with that error data. And then finally, we return the state. So we've been able to encapsulate all of this logic as well as our async reducer into a single use async hook that we could put into a utils module and then use all over our code base just like this.